Welcome again to the 2013 George Rawlyk Memorial Lectures of the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies at Acadia University and Acadia Divinity College in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. In our first lecture, we focused on John Smythe of Gainsborough, one of the two great pioneers of the Baptist faith and life in both the United Kingdom, England, and of course throughout the rest of the world. Tonight, we focus in the second lecture on Thomas Helwys. Helwys was trained at Gray's Inn for the law in London, and he then returned to his native Nottinghamshire, where he practiced law and was a man of deep conviction. He joined forces with his pastor, John Smythe, and together they emigrated under great persecution to Holland, specifically the city of Amsterdam, where they formed a congregation and put into practice believers' baptism. Later, about 1611, Helwys was to split from his pastor and return to England, and there form the first Baptist church on English soil, making him a true pioneer of the Baptist tradition. Helwys is remembered as a person who understood well the nature of the church in a renewed and reformed way, complete religious liberty, and of course, his conviction that one needed to stand firm for one's beliefs. We join Nick Bunker, our lecturer for this series, the author of Making Haste from Babylon, as he introduces us to the redoubtable Thomas Helwys.
Well, thank you once again. Thank you to ACBAS. I'd like to thank the Acadia University, the Divinity College, and Bill Brackney for the very kind and flattering invitation to give these lectures. Tonight, in the second of my lectures, I'll be talking about Thomas Helwys. Last night I spoke about his friend John Smythe, the radical English Puritan and then separatist who travelled from England to the Netherlands in 1608 and became one of the early pioneers of what became the Baptist faith. Last night I was speaking primarily about religion, about theology, about spiritual matters. This evening I'll be talking more about politics, the kind of political matrix from which men such as Smythe and Helwys came. Now, who was Thomas Helwys? He was an enormously important figure, an enormously influential figure in the history of the Baptist faith. He's less well known to members of other denominations, less well known because Baptist history generally is not so well known to members of other denominations, but nevertheless, I think anyone who studies his life can see what a tremendously important figure he was. He was the author in 1613, of an important book, The Mystery of Iniquity, written in Amsterdam and then later published in London, which was probably one of the first and one of the most eloquent defenses of the concept of religious freedom ever to appear in English. In the context of having suffered religious persecution himself in England, Helwys flatly denied the right of the king, and by extension other kinds of government as well, to dictate the religious views of the king's subjects. According to Helwys, James I, the king of England at the time, was a mortal man and not God, and therefore hath no power over ye immortal souls of his subjects, to make laws and ordinance for them, and to set spiritual laws over them. Now that was a very radical thing indeed to say in 1612. In fact, in some parts of the world, it would still be a very radical thing to say today. And that is the core of the reason, I think, why Thomas Helwys remains such an important figure, and why it's such a great interest to probe into his background. That wasn't quite the way I came at the study of Thomas Helwys. The reason I came at the study of Thomas Helwys was because I was interested in the origins and the background of the separatists from the Nottinghamshire area of England, who became the leadership and the core of the Plymouth colonists who travelled on the Mayflower to America in 1620. And so I came at Thomas Helwys really from sort of laterally, from the side, so to speak. I was interested in Thomas Helwys because I wanted to find out what the life of Thomas Helwys could tell us about the beliefs of that other group of people who became, as I say, the nucleus of the Plymouth colony. So that's how I began examining his career. And as I examined his career, though, it began to dawn upon me that he was important not simply as an apostle of religious freedom, but as himself a very important instigator of that movement which eventually led to the colonization of New England. Now, he was born about 1575, died in about 1614, We don't know exactly where he was born, we don't know when he was born, we don't know exactly when he died or where he died, although it was probably in prison in London. He had returned to England from the Netherlands a year or so earlier. So he's something of an enigma. His dates are uncertain. Not only his dates, but even the spelling of his name. Now, our Elizabethan forebears had a delightfully anarchic attitude towards spelling, and particularly in the case of the Helwys family. The documents that survive relating to him have a very wide variety of spellings indeed. Helwys, Helwys, Heliwys, Helwes, Elwys, Elways, Eloways, Elvish, and there are probably some more that I haven't been able to find. Today, if a name survives at all in England, it survives as Elwys, which is probably, so if you meet someone called Elwys, well, they're almost certainly some kind of relation, distant kinsman of Thomas Helwys. But the fact that the name is spelt in such a wide variety of ways actually does tell us something interesting. It tells you that the Helwys family, although they had achieved a certain rank and distinction and a certain amount of wealth by the period with which we're concerned, that is to say 1580s, 1590s and onwards, although they were a rising family, they were unknown quantities. They were a new family. They weren't a long-established dynasty, and that's why people didn't know how to spell their name. There were a lot of uncertainties that surrounded them about their precise rank, their precise status. Thomas Helwys liked to describe himself as a gentleman. He used the Latin expression generosus to describe himself, but there was some question in people's minds about whether he was really entitled to that rank. There was even some doubt about the status of his marriage, as we shall see, and he was accused of fornication at one stage. I think almost certainly unfairly, but these kinds of elusive questions tend to surround him, and there are reasons for that, as we shall see. Now, despite all these uncertainties and these elements of enigma about Thomas Helwys, there's one thing we can absolutely be certain about, which is that he played an enormous and important role in the events in 1607 and 1608 that led to the emigration from England of a group of about 50 or 100 radical Protestant nonconformists who travelled first to Amsterdam and then in some cases on to the Dutch city of Leiden, and in due course became the nucleus of the Mayflower pilgrims who sailed to America. John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrim Church at Leiden, the man who was effectively the spiritual mentor from afar of the Plymouth colony in New England, had no doubts at all about the role of Thomas Helwys in their original emigration from England in 1608. He said of Thomas Helwys that, above all other guides, he furthered this passage into strange countries, and when he brought oars, he brought sails. And as we shall see, that is quite literally true. So let's see what we can do to shed some more light on Thomas Helwys, his background, and in particular his motivation, which is really what I wanted to try to get at. Because I felt that if we could get at the motivation of Thomas Helwys, the motivation to become a religious radical, a Puritan, and then a separatist, if we can get at that, then it will help to shed some light on the motivations and the background of the Plymouth colonists too. Now, he was a man who emerged out of a local matrix of circumstances, a very definable context in the county of Nottinghamshire. And in a moment I'll talk about where Nottinghamshire is, its location and its characteristics. Nottinghamshire was a divided county. It was a very turbulent county. It had a reputation for that, and the reputation was fully justified. It was also a county where the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, in the 1530s and 40s, had had a particularly profound impact. It was also a county where there was a substantial lingering element of Roman Catholicism. This was true throughout the period with which we're concerned. And that's important too, very important, because it was a county where there was a particularly acute sectarian divide. And finally, it was a county where, after the arrival of King James I on the throne in 1603, there was the creation of a new local authoritarian regime. Now, this was something that happened across the country as a whole. There was a new authoritarianism under James I, but it happened with a particular force and with a particular significance, and it was particularly important in Nottinghamshire. Now, where is it? Well, this is a map of Nottinghamshire. And you'll see that it's a rather long, elongated county extending from south to north. London would be about 120 miles to the south, somewhere down here. Now, Nottinghamshire starts here on the border of Leicestershire, and this in effect is what we describe as Midland England. It's if you like, the northern end of the south of England. It is an area primarily arable, relatively prosperous at the time, relatively peaceful, relatively stable. At the northern end of Nottinghamshire, you're into northern England. You're into Yorkshire and over here into Derbyshire. This is a much more rugged area. It was a much more wilder area at the time, economically more backward than the south, and also an area in which Catholicism lingered on. So Nottinghamshire essentially was a kind of frontier county. If you look at the eastern side of the county, you'll see that it's rather jagged and uneven. That's because that is the River Trent. The River Trent defines the eastern edge of the county and then runs down and meanders down until it enters Leicestershire here. The River Trent was legally the boundary between the north and the south of the country. To the south, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire and so on, religion came under the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury. In the north, it came under the authority of the Archbishop of York. There was also a kind of separate government in the north, operating under delegated powers from London, known as the Council of the North, which was based up at York, up here. So it was, to some extent, a frontier county. The most important, though, and the most interesting, the most famous geographical feature of Nottinghamshire is, of course, Sherwood Forest. And when you think of Sherwood Forest, of course, you think of Robin Hood. Sherwood Forest essentially is here, occupying most of the western half of Nottinghamshire. And Sherwood Forest has a reputation as being a den of thieves and outlaws, and that indeed is what it had been during the medieval period. Robin Hood had indeed, whoever he was, there are a number of candidates for the honour of being the real Robin Hood, had indeed operated primarily in this area here, across the Nottinghamshire-Yorkshire border. And the county retained a reputation for being a frontier county with an unusually high degree of crime, lawlessness and mayhem, and that remained so for many centuries, beginning probably about the 11th, 12th century, and it continued into the Elizabethan period, as we shall see. Now, we are very fortunate in relation to Nottinghamshire that Nottinghamshire has a particularly rich endowment of local archives, which gives us an enormous amount of material with which to work, and there's a number of reasons for that, and they're quite important. The Sherwood Forest area of Nottinghamshire is also known as the Dukeries, and it's been known as that for about 200 years or so. And that's because during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Sherwood Forest area of Nottinghamshire became essentially the fiefdom of two dukes, the Duke of Portland and the Duke of Newcastle. The Duke of Portland and the Duke of Newcastle, who were also related to the Duke of Devonshire, who had estates just to the north, they created very large landed estates in the area. And of course they also therefore created very large troves of archives. What tends to happen in Britain is that landed estates are very good indeed at preserving documentary records. They tend to collect a great deal of material. When they buy a new piece of property, they also acquire the records that went with that piece of property, sometimes extending way back in the early medieval period. And this means that the archives left behind by the Dukes of Newcastle and Dukes of Portland, both of which are kept in Nottingham today in archive repositories, contain a huge amount of material, some of which has really no direct relevance to the Dukes themselves, but which contains enormous amounts of material of relevance potentially to students of other aspects of the life of the county, particularly the circumstances which will be concerned, the religious history of the latter Elizabethan period. Nottinghamshire is also lucky in another respect, which is that we have another excellent series of records called the Archdeaconry records. These are the records of the Archdeacon of Nottingham, who was responsible for enforcing discipline within the Church of England at this period. In most counties, those have largely disappeared. In Nottingham, as it happens, they survive and in excellent condition, and they're at the University of Nottingham, where some of them have been digitised. You can actually find them on the web. Only a relatively small proportion, but some have survived. We also have in Nottinghamshire the quarter session records. In England at the time, right up until the 19th century, the principal organ of local government was what was known as the quarter sessions, which consisted of regular meetings every 3 months, every quarter, of the justices of the peace who ran the shire, who collected taxes, acted as judges, administered the affairs of the county. In many counties, the quarter sessions minutes have disappeared. In Nottinghamshire, they survive in their entirety with the period with which I'll be concerned. And that's a tremendously important source of information. And also in Nottinghamshire, we have an excellent county history. In the late 17th century, a man called Thoroton, an antiquarian, compiled a superb collection of records relating to each individual parish in the county. It was then updated and republished by others in the late 18th century. And it's a huge treasure trove, again, of material which can be used to cast all sorts of light on the origins of men such as Thomas Helwys. So we're very fortunate in Nottinghamshire. It's unusually richly endowed with archives. And the paper trail includes all kinds of different things. We've got the family papers of the aristocracy that I described. We've got account books, books of memoranda, private correspondence, official correspondence. We've got the records of the quarter sessions. We have records in London that relate to Nottinghamshire. We have unpublished records of the activities of the Council of the North, which I referred in the Privy Council. And we've got a vast array of material. I won't go through all of it. We've got a vast array. And that means that we're very fortunate in respect to this county's archival trail. Now, what was Nottinghamshire all about? What was going on in Nottinghamshire that made it unusual? Why was it an unusually turbulent place? Now, putting it very crudely, in the latter Middle Ages, the Crown, the central authorities in London, were engaged on a long project of trying to bring order to relatively unruly parts of the country. There were perennial problems of crime and lawlessness in some areas of England. There was no police force, there was no standing army, tax revenue was scarce, there was a great deal of local strife between members of the gentry, members of the aristocracy. And from about the middle of the 14th century onward, the successive kings of England attempted to solve these problems of lawlessness and disorder and weakness of government locally by building what they called a regional affinity. That is to say, a group of local landowning gentlemen, whether they were members of the aristocracy or members of what we call the landed gentry, knights of the shire, in other words, a group of supporters of right-thinking, public-spirited gentlemen who would form the kind of local arm of the central bureaucracy, such as it was. They created a new kind of official, the Justices of the Peace, of whom there are about 25 or 30 in each county. These were local landowners, as I say, knights of the shire, who would serve on a voluntary, unpaid basis as local magistrates, meeting in the quarter sessions. In due course, they also created another kind of official, the Lord Lieutenant, who would be a local nobleman who would be given the job of acting as, so to speak, as a kind of deputy of the Crown in each county, particularly charged with the duty of organising defence in times of war. If war broke out against the Scots, or if war was threatened by the French or the Spanish, it would be the job of the Lord Lieutenant go around the county trying to raise volunteers to form an army, whether an expeditionary force or an army of defence. Now, this process of trying to build a stronger form of local government in each county was interrupted by the Wars of the Roses, which of course were a traumatic experience affecting the north of England in particular. But then the process resumed after 1485 with the arrival of the Tudors, and it was greatly accelerated for a number of reasons by the Protestant Reformation during the 16th century, which gave the Crown a new opportunity to stamp its mark upon the regions and the counties. Now, Nottinghamshire was a county that it was particularly difficult to control for a number of reasons. First of all, it was relatively poor. Now, if you remember, going back to the slide with the map, Sherwood Forest occupied a very substantial chunk of the county. Pretty much the whole of this kind of area here was Sherwood Forest. Sherwood Forest was pretty much a wasteland. The land was of poor quality, it was useful for very little. And what this effectively meant was that Nottinghamshire, say, was a relatively poor county. Poor, marginal, and something of a frontier zone. In addition to that, Nottinghamshire did not have a local magnate who could serve as Lord Lieutenant. It didn't have one great aristocrat who could be enlisted by the Crown to do its bidding. Instead, power was widely dispersed among a large number of competing gentry families, of whom there were probably about 40 or 50 during the 15th century. And they were apt to quarrel amongst themselves. There was a particularly famous incident in Nottinghamshire in 1411 called the Basset Law Riot, in which two warring clans essentially fought a pitched battle between each other with 400 or 500 men on each side. This was a factional feud between different members of the landed gentry, which ended up with 3 or 4 of them cooling their heels in the Tower of London for quite a prolonged period. And this was characteristic of Nottinghamshire, and one can find examples of this kind of strife going on into the 16th century, on a slightly smaller scale, but as we shall see, is still important. So in Nottingham, as I say, powers dispersed in Nottinghamshire among this local gentry of 40 or 50 knights. And they were unstable also because of demography. One of the problems of the period, of course, was that families tended to die out in the male line relatively quickly because of the obvious problems of infant mortality, disease, epidemic, and so forth. And so this local landed elite of 40 or 50 families was in the process of continual flux and change. Old families were disappearing, new families were emerging, and the result in Nottinghamshire in particular was a degree, as I say, of strife and violence that was unusual by the standards of the period. This gradually began to change under the Tudors for a number of reasons. One of those reasons was that Nottinghamshire gradually became more wealthy. It became, for example, a coal mining county, which was to remain for hundreds of years. One of the great defining features of Nottinghamshire until the last few decades, in fact, was the fact that it was one of England's great coal mining counties. It also became a county with a substantial textile industry. The lace makers of Nottingham, particularly famous. Also the knitting of woolen stockings. It was in Nottinghamshire that they invented what was called framework knitting of stockings. These things are terribly important because they gave the county extra sources of income, developing from the 16th century onwards. But perhaps the most important thing that occurred in Nottinghamshire at the period, perhaps the most profound effect, was that of the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, Nottinghamshire had a number of monastic houses. It had altogether, if I can find my notes, 13 monasteries, the most famous of which was Newstead Abbey, which later became the home of the poet Lord Byron. All of these 13 monasteries were dissolved by the Crown in the 1530s, 1540s, and their land was redistributed in various ways among the landed gentry of the period. And there were some particular beneficiaries of this process, the most important of whom were the Talbot and the Manners families. The Talbot family were the Earls of Shrewsbury, and the Manners family were the Earls of Rutland. The Manners family still exists, of course. They are now the Dukes of Rutland, and they are based at the Belvoir Castle, which is not far from the area we'll be concerned with. The Talbots have survived in a sort of vestigial form. They're no longer as important as they were. Now, these two families became increasingly powerful during the course of the 16th century as they sought to ally themselves with the Crown. In particular, the 5th Earl of Shrewsbury, who became president of the Council of the North, the body that supervised the north of England, and the 2nd Earl of Rutland, who became the Lord Lieutenant of both Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. They became increasingly important. And one of the ways in which they became important was that they laid a larger claim to old monastic estates than anybody else. They were given large quantities of monastic land, in effect, by the Crown in return for faithful and loyal service. And so they became extremely powerful locally, particularly, as we shall see, the Earls of Shrewsbury, that is to say, the Talbots. And as it happens, Nottinghamshire and the area immediately around it still to this day bear the marks of this because of the extraordinary architecture that was created in Nottinghamshire at the time. As Nottinghamshire and the county immediately next to it, Derbyshire, became wealthier, so they built buildings on a far grander scale than had ever been built before in this region. This is Hardwicke Hall, very famous. This was the building associated with Bess of Hardwicke, Elizabeth, Countess of Hardwicke, who in due course married the Earl of Shrewsbury and became one of the most wealthiest, probably the wealthiest single woman in Elizabethan England. And this building was built for her by a family called the Smytheson family, a family of architects, who built a series of similar properties, not always quite so grand, all the way across this part of England. And these still survive today, and they are a superb indicator, a sort of visible sign of the changes that were occurring in the county at this point. The Smythesons also built this building called Worksop Manor. This was built in 1586. It was built by Robert Smytheson for Gilbert Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. And as we can see, this building actually plays quite a significant part in the story that lies ahead. Sadly, it was destroyed by fire in the middle of the 18th century, and almost nothing of it survives except for some lodge gates and a few bits of rubble, in effect. But as you can see, it was a very grand house indeed, probably one of the grandest houses in the north of England, and a visible symbol, as I say, of the changes that were overtaking the county. It was also a house that had some indirect connection with the Mayflower Pilgrims too, because the man who ran this property on behalf of the Earls of Shrewsbury, the manager of this estate, was a man called Richard Torr. And Richard Torr, the steward of Worksop Manor, was also the leading resident in the village of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire, which was the home of William Brewster, one of the leaders of the Mayflower Pilgrims. Scrooby being the place in Nottinghamshire traditionally most closely associated with the Plymouth colony. And so this building, which was going up in the 1580s, completed by 1590 or so, was something that would have been very well known indeed to all the people who later took part in the events I'll be referring to, the creation of separatism in the region. It would have been familiar to William Brewster, familiar to Thomas Helwys, familiar to John Smythe, familiar to John Robinson, and it was a symbol of the power of the Shrewsbury family, who were the most significant makers and shakers in the region by this stage. Now, not only did the dissolution of the monasteries and the sale of monastic land lead to the enrichment of people like the Talbots and the Manners families, but it also led to an influx of newcomers from outside. And it's at this point that we start to get close to the origins of Thomas Helwys. There was a family called the Hollis family. Sir William Hollis, born 1471, died 1542. He came from London, where he was a mercer and he was a dealer in cloth. He used to supply luxury fabrics to Henry VIII. He was a very wealthy man indeed. He became in due course Lord Mayor of London. As far as we know, and certainly all the records point in this direction, he was a staunch Roman Catholic. He wasn't Protestant at all, but this did not prevent him from speculating in monastic land. And what he did was that he bought a sizable chunk of monastic property from the Manners family, that is to say from the Earl of Rutland, and in 1537 he arrived in Nottinghamshire with a view to turning himself into a local landowning gentleman. A very characteristic feature of English history which has happened over and over again. Men who make their money in the city of London use that money to buy landed estates in the countryside, where they in due course become country squires and try to convince everybody they never worked in anything as grubby as finance at all. Now, this is Horton Hall, which was the seat of Sir William Hollis. It's located pretty much in the centre of Nottinghamshire. We'll come back to its location in a little while. This picture actually dates from 1709, so it's rather later. But the building you see there is, in effect, the Tudor mansion created by Sir William Hollis and his son, who was also called Sir William Hollis. All of this has now disappeared. The river's still there, of course. There are the barns, one or two of the barns, I think, still exist, but most of the property has vanished, and so have the gardens, which lay to the left. There was a chapel associated with the property which still survives in ruins, which is just over here, and immediately just off the picture over to the left, to the west of the building, there was a property called Houghton Lound, which was a kind of a home farm or a farm associated with the property. And the reason that's significant is that's where the Helwys family lived. So the Hollis family had emerged as newcomers. They had bought monastic land, and they were engaged in a project to become leading members of the local landed gentry. And hopefully in time they aspired to become members of the aristocracy as well. And in doing so, they enlisted the support of the Helwys family. Now, it is conceivable, by the way, because of the similarities between the names, that there may have been some distant element of kinship between Helwys and Hollis. It's not entirely clear. It's possible, and it may explain why they became so close. It's possible that there may have been, but certainly not certain. Now, William Helwys was a farmer, came from a farming background. His father had simply been a yeoman farmer locally, not a particularly wealthy one as far as we can see, simply a local yeoman farmer. William Helwys himself was a yeoman farmer. He was the tenant of Houghton Lound, the property immediately to the west of the main hall owned by the Hollis family. He died in either 1556 or 1557. And he and his sons became loyal servants of the Hollis family. They became effectively estate managers and real estate agents on their behalf. Now, we're very fortunate because about a century later, the Hollis family had a historian, a member of the family who wrote a manuscript history of the family, which was then republished in the 1950s. And it refers specifically to the relationship between the Hollis family and the Helwyses. It refers to the fact that Sir William Hollis Jr., who had taken over the running of the estate in the 1540s, that Sir William Hollis Jr. had two important servants who looked after his affairs. To his servants he was very bountiful, whereof some of the more thriving disposition made very good use. And one of those men was John Helwys. And now, John Helwys was the eldest son of William Helwys. John Helwys, as I say, appears to have been the steward or the bailiff or the manager of the Hollis lands in this area. And he assisted them in a series of real estate transactions as they created a kind of network of property, an empire of property stretching across 3 counties and over about 50 miles. Properties from Derbyshire into Nottinghamshire and then into Lincolnshire to the east. And in addition to acting on behalf of the Hollis family, John Helwys also acted on his own behalf. His name can be found in a series of records called the Calendar of the Patent Rolls, records which survive from the reign of Elizabeth I, which show him wheeling in, dealing in property across the same sort of area. And he created his own rather smaller empire of property, as I say, smaller than that of the Hollis family, but still very significant. And what it meant was that in due course his son, Gervase Helwys, was able to become a knight. In due course he became Sheriff of Lincolnshire in 1607. He became a distinguished and important figure with a very large network of influence across those same 3 counties. William Helwys also had a second son called Geoffrey, and Geoffrey also did extremely well. And I remember this family in the 1520s and 30s had simply been a local farming family of no particular distinction and not particularly wealthy. Geoffrey Helwys went to London as an apprentice. He entered the Merchant Taylors' Company, which was the largest of the livery companies who dominated the City of London at the time. He became an alderman, in other words, a senior member of the Corporation of London, which was essentially the municipal government of London. And in due course, he became Sheriff of London, which was a post next in significance only to the Lord Mayor himself. And that happened in 1607, the same year in which Sir Gervase Helwys was Sheriff of Lincolnshire. So in other words, the Helwys family had done extremely well for themselves. They had risen meteorically. Now, they had built an empire, a little empire of real estate, and they had carved out roles for themselves in local government too. They had also acquired an element of patronage in the church, because of course one of the features of the English situation at the time was that, and this is a characteristic of the English, of the Church of England, which is terribly important historically, was that the parish ministers were usually nominated by local members of the landed gentry or aristocracy. And Sir Gervase Helwys had acquired the right to nominate the ministers of at least 2 parishes. And because of the people he chose, because the people he chose tended to be Puritan sympathisers, we can be pretty sure that Sir Gervase Helwys, the son of John Helwys, was himself a man of Puritan inclinations. We'll come back to him a little later. There's also some evidence that in London, Geoffrey Helwys was the same sort of disposition. There was also a third son of William Helwys, and this was Edmund Helwys. And he was the father of Thomas Helwys, who is our man, the separatist. And with Edmund Helwys, we start to see emerging a clearer picture of the religious allegiance of this very aspirational, ambitious family. Up until 1557, it's pretty clear that the Helwys family had remained staunch Roman Catholics. That's because the will of William Helwys, the father of the family, the will which still survives in the archives in York, the will of William Helwys is a very conventional will which contains an invocation of the Virgin Mary. That is something which is characteristic of the wills of people who remained either Roman Catholic or non-committed, but there's no indication he was any kind of radical Protestant. That is not the case with his son Edmund Helwys. On the contrary, his son Edmund Helwys was clearly a very, very firm Calvinist, a fiery Calvinist, an extremely fiery evangelical Calvinist. Because in 1590, when he died, he left behind of a will that was very different indeed. Edmund Helwys, his will dated September 24th, 1590, is an extremely unusual document. It was common at the time when people made a will to have a preamble. And the preamble to the will often tells you something about their religious leanings or other kinds of connections they may have had. Now, sometimes the preamble was simply a formula written by the vicar of the parish or the lawyer or whoever happened to be drafting the will for them, but sometimes the preamble to the will is very distinct, and it certainly is in this case. It's also extremely long. The will of Edmund Helwys goes on for about a page and a half, if I remember correctly. And I can distinctly remember having to decipher it from the rather difficult and obscure microfilm in the archives at York. It took me, I think, about half a day. Only to discover at the end of it, it had already been transcribed by somebody else 60 years before, so I didn't actually need to bother in the first place, which is something unfortunate that happens. Now, this very long preamble actually includes quotations, verbatim quotations from several books of the Bible, from the Epistle to the Romans, from the Epistle to Galatians, from the book of Job, and indeed even quotations from St. Augustine. This is very unusual indeed. It's very unusual to see that in the preamble to a will. It also uses some of the characteristic language of Protestants of the 16th century, that is to say, the language of justification by faith. And this is just an extract from it. In the name of God, Amen. I, Edmund Helwys, alias Elwys, of Broxtowe in the county of Nottingham, gentleman, whole and sound in body and of good and perfect remembrance, the Lord be praised, and yet considering the uncertainty of this world, which is justly termed a dirty sty, a grave of thorns, where is nothing but fear, shame, tears, labour, sickness, sin, and death, do make this my last will and testament. Now that is pretty strong language, even by the standards of the 16th century. It is rare to find the preamble of a will being quite as graphic as that. It is rare also to find a direct quotation, for example, from the Epistle to the Romans in a will. Later on, just on the same page, Helwys specifically refers to the famous passage from the Epistle to the Romans in which St. Paul sums up effectively the heart of the Protestant Reformation. That is to say, St. Paul saith, Romans 3, that God is the justifier by faith. Now, so it's unusual to see something quite as categorical as that. Now, clearly, by the end of the 1580s, the Helwys family had become fervent Calvinists with Puritan affiliations via Sir Joas, who we met a moment ago. Not only is there the will of Edmund Helwys, but there is also another rather remarkable document which survives, which casts some light on their attitudes. And that is a book published in 1589. It's a book called A Marvel Deciphered. Only a handful of copies of that book survive. In fact, I think only one copy survives probably in the British Library in London, where you can still find it. A Marvel Deciphered is an extraordinary book published shortly after the Spanish Armada, and in fact it deals with the Spanish Armada. That is the subject of the book. It identifies Elizabeth I as the fulfillment of a prophecy in the book of Revelations. In the book of Revelations, chapter 12, there is a reference to a woman clothed with a crown of 12 stars. And the author of A Marvel Deciphered specifically identifies that with Queen Elizabeth. He regards the book of Revelation, in other words, as a prophecy of Queen Elizabeth's triumph over the Spanish Armada. And the reason it's interesting to us is because the author of A Marvel Deciphered is a man called Edward Helwys. Now, who exactly was Edward Helwys? In my opinion, it's almost certain that it's the same man as Edmund Helwys, because at this particular period, it was quite common for Edmund and Edward to be used interchangeably, the two names to be used interchangeably. And it was also not uncommon for printers to make errors in the setting up of their books. The most clinching evidence, though, I think, is simply the fact that if you were ever to read A Marvel Deciphered, you would find that the language of that book is very similar indeed to the language of the will of Edmund Helwys, dating from 1590. Just read you a little bit of it. It's a remarkable little work. It's not unique. There were other examples of writers at the time using the book of Revelation to cast light upon the Spanish Armada, viewing it in the context of the great struggle against Spain. But nevertheless, it is very striking in its language. And this is what Edmund Helwys says in A Marvel Deciphered towards the end. He says, Satan, which never ceaseth his envious invasions against the children of God, is now constrained to furnish his agent and eldest son, Antichrist, with engines to invade the household of faith, namely fire, sword, treason, and other strange and ungodly tools. But God himself, having care at his own pleasure for the safety and consolation of his elect, will confound even 1,000 sail of ships if they arrive within a mile of any shore of England. Now, as I say, this is not unique, but it's still very striking indeed. And what it reflects is not only the Calvinist faith of the Helwys family, but also reflects the fairly intense mood of alarm and anxiety in England during the 1580s, a time when the nation seemed to be in peril. National security was in danger, probably the greatest national security crisis until the end of the 18th century and the threat of invasion of Napoleon. Everywhere they saw enemies in their midst. They saw renegade Roman Catholics threatening possibly to restore Mary Queen of Scots to the throne, hence her execution in 1587. In other words, an intense mood among Protestants, such as the Helwys family in this region, of anxiety and fear about the future, but also a mood of defiance as well, which is what we see expressed in that work and indeed in the will of Edmund Helwys from 1590. So to sum up where we have got so far, in the mid-1580s, Nottinghamshire was a county that was still prone to turbulence. It was a county where the people were particularly alarmed about the threat of Roman Catholicism, not least because the county still contained a large body of renegade Roman Catholics. And of course, Mary Queen of Scots, throughout much of the decade, had actually been imprisoned not far away. She was in captivity at Sheffield Castle, only on the border of the county. She had been in captivity at Chatsworth, which is not far away either. She had been in captivity at various locations under the care of the Earl of Shrewsbury, and her presence in the area only served, I think, to heighten the alarm among some of the local Protestants about what might lay in wait for them. There was also in the county a fairly strong local Puritan presence, receiving a degree of toleration from above. The Puritan presence could be found in enclaves, if you like, scattered in various parts of the county, including the villages that are now most closely associated with the origins of the Pilgrim Fathers, such as Scrooby. Men such as William Brewster, who went on to become one of the leaders of the Pilgrim College in Massachusetts, and other people associated with him, friends and family, they were able effectively at this period to operate little Puritan enclaves in parishes where they were particularly influential. And there was a strong element of local Puritanism among such people. Scattered about, it wasn't all pervasive, but nevertheless it was quite extensive. And it enjoyed a degree of official toleration because at this point the authorities in England were so concerned about the threat of Catholicism that they regarded Protestant nonconformists as a pretty minor issue. The Queen herself wasn't happy with them, but many of her leading officials, particularly William Cecil, the Lord Treasurer, and the Secretary of State, Sir Francis Walsingham, were happy to turn a blind eye to Protestant nonconformity if the Protestant nonconformists were essentially allies in the great struggle against Catholicism. It was also a county, of course, where, as I said earlier, the Talbots had become increasingly powerful. Now, the Talbots were a slightly disruptive influence because although they had become so powerful, they were suspected of having Catholic sympathies themselves. Elizabeth I indeed actually became very unhappy with the Earl of Shrewsbury, who was nominally entrusted with the supervision of Mary Queen of Scots, because she feared that he was becoming too close to her. And there were various dark rumours that circulated about the nature of the relationship between the Earl of Shrewsbury and Mary Queen of Scots. So I think rumours which were almost certainly false, but nevertheless some people listened to them. There was also a local landed gentry, ranking slightly below the Earls of Shrewsbury, including the Hollis family, who were at loggerheads with them. The county had continued to be marked, as I said, by strife and violence, and in particular there was a long-standing feud that developed between the Hollis family and another family called the Stanhopes on the one hand, and the Talbots on the other. And this became a cause célèbre which ran for a number of years and attracted attention at the highest levels in London. And I'll just read you something about that feud, which is not only colourful but also rather important. As the Talbots had become more powerful, so they became increasingly resented by other members of the local landowning elite. And they found themselves engaged in this feud with the Hollis and Stanhope families. The Earls of Shrewsbury had been hoping that John Hollis, who was the heir to the estates at Houghton, would marry into their own family, the Talbots, thus creating a kind of huge dynastic alliance and a huge extension of their own empire of property. But the Hollis family refused to do that. Instead, John Hollis married somebody from the Stanhopes. And this led to a great deal of bad blood throughout the 1590s. The feud took the shape of, for example, something like a pitched battle in 1593. In 1593, there was a pitched battle on the River Trent. The Stanhope family had decided to erect a weir on the River Trent in order to generate power for a watermill that they were operating. The Talbot family took exception to this because they claimed authority over the river. They claimed the right to levy tolls on the river, and so they sent a body of armed men, numbering, it is said, several hundred strong, to forcibly remove the weir and then to erect fortifications on the bank to prevent it being put in place again. That was the first sort of pitched battle between them. There was also a series of quarrels and feuds between the Hollis family and the Talbots, arising from the fact that John Hollis appears to have cast some aspersions on the chastity of the Countess of Shrewsbury. Now, it's not entirely clear what he said, but it caused a great deal of agitation. And this led, in due course, to a violent confrontation in Sherwood Forest in 1598, in which John Hollis stuck his sword through a particularly sensitive part of the anatomy of one of the household retainers of the Talbot family. And this went on and on for years and years and years, and it caused a certain amount of alarm in official circles in London because they were fed up with Nottingham having this reputation for strife. They felt it was most unfortunate, especially because, of course, they were so concerned about the threat of Catholicism in the area. And to give you some idea of what the tone of life was actually like in Nottinghamshire, I'll just quote to you from something written by the Countess of Shrewsbury. The Countess of Shrewsbury came to hate the Stanhope family so much that she decided to send a letter to them telling them exactly what she thought of them. So she gave her herald, or her messenger, a letter to be taken to Sir Thomas Stanhope. And the letter runs like this, from the messenger. "My lady the Countess," said the messenger, "hath commanded to say, Sir Thomas, thus much to you, that though you be more wretched, vile, and miserable than any creature living, and for your wickedness become more ugly in shape than the vilest toad in the world, that she should be contented that you should live, and doth no ways wish your death, but only to this end, that all the plagues and miseries that may befall any man may light upon a caitiff such as you are, that you should live to have all your friends forsake you, and without your great repentance, which she looketh not for, because your life had been so bad, you will be damned perpetually in hellfire." So that was what the Countess of Shrewsbury thought about the Stanhopes. So I think you get some idea about the kind of place that Nottinghamshire was by the end of the 1580s. It was not a happy county. And this was the county in which Thomas Helwys grew up. And importantly, the Helwys family were on one side of the divide. They were associated with the Hollis and Stanhope interests. As we saw, the Helwys family owed their fortune effectively to their having been loyal servants of the Hollis family. But in addition to that, they actually rented land from them. Thomas Helwys' father Edmund had a small estate at a place called Broxtowe just outside Nottinghamshire. It was only leasehold land. The lease was due to run out in 1607. And that land was leased from the Stanhopes, who in turn had got it from the Hollis family. So the Stanhopes were effectively landlords of the Helwys family, in addition to the fact the Helwys family had always been so connected with the Hollises. So the Helwys family were very much on the Stanhope-Hollis side in all these ructions, and therefore they were on the opposite side of the county from the Talbot family. And of course, not only that, but the Helwys family were Calvinists. They were fierce Protestants, while the Talbots were Roman Catholics, or at any rate Roman Catholic sympathisers. So you can see that the Helwys family were potentially in a rather awkward position if the Talbots ever became all powerful. And that, of course, as we shall see, is what happened. Now, Thomas Helwys the separatist, what do we know about him? Where was he circa 1600 when the events with which we're most concerned really start? Well, we don't really know very much. As I said, we don't know exactly when he was born. Probably about 1575, might have been a bit earlier, probably a bit earlier, I think. We know that he was educated, or at any rate we know that he entered an institution called Gray's Inn in London, because the records of Gray's Inn in London show a Thomas Helwys on the books in 1593. Now, Gray's Inn was one of the inns of court where barristers were educated, where barristers were trained for the legal profession. I don't need to explain what a barrister is in Canada, because of course you have barristers in Canada, where in America, if you mention a barrister in America, they think it's someone who serves you an overpriced cup of coffee in Starbucks. Now, so Thomas Helwys was educated at Gray's Inn. Gray's Inn had a bit of a reputation at the time, quite justifiably, for being a stronghold of Puritans. There were a number of senior members of Gray's Inn in London who were indeed Puritan sympathisers. There were a number of senior members, senior lawyers at Gray's Inn who actually defended Puritans in litigation brought against them by the church authorities. So it is possible that at Gray's Inn, Thomas Helwys, if you like, acquired even more of a grounding in Calvinism stroke Puritanism than he had already acquired from his father. It's possible. Trouble is, we really don't know anything about his period at Gray's Inn except for the fact that he was entered on its books in 1593. He may only have stayed there a few months, who knows. We also know, as I said, that he was the tenant of a leasehold estate rented from the Stanhopes near Nottingham, and we know a little bit about the size of the estate and how much money he had, because in 1593, I think it was, 1593, he got involved, no, 1594, he got involved in some litigation. He got involved in a lawsuit in the Court of Chancery in London, and some records relating to it have survived. And they give us a bit of a picture of Thomas Helmers as a very young man, probably no more than about 20. And he was accused in this lawsuit of deceitful and fraudulent dealing in relation to a transaction in land. And again, I don't think we should read too much into that, because as any of you who have ever been involved in civil litigation will know, people are always throwing accusations at each other from one side or the other, and very often they bear little relation to reality. But he was accused anyway of fraudulent and deceitful dealing. But at least the document does give us one little detail, which is that it mentions about that he had a herd of 300 or 400 sheep, which is interesting, because if he had a herd of 300 or 400 sheep, then in effect, although he was reasonably prosperous, although he was reasonably substantial as a landowner, he certainly wasn't a rich man. That wasn't enough to make you a rich man. If you assume, let's say, that each sheep had an acre of land on which to graze, then effectively he would have had a maximum of about 300 or 400 acres, which, although it was a goodly size for an estate, wasn't huge. So although he was a landowner, his land was actually leasehold, and he could hardly be described as wealthy, and he never in fact became a justice of the peace. His relations, of course, his uncle Geoffrey and his cousin Sir Gervase were very wealthy men indeed, and they were able to give him, as far as we can see, a degree of support, and they remained on very good terms with him. That we can see from the wills that they left behind, because when they died they referred to him in their will, and they left him legacy, so he was on good terms with them, but he wasn't actually very wealthy in himself, and he couldn't really aspire to the status of justice of the peace. He also had a curious situation with regards to his marriage. Now, in the lawsuit of 1594, there's a reference to his future wife, Joan Ashmore. She's referred to as his servant or housekeeper. That was in 1594. Now, 1598, he was accused of having married her irregularly. Now, he had married her, I think it was 1595. He married in 1595. There's a record of that in the parish register of the parish which they lived near Nottingham. But in 1598 he was subject to what may have been a scurrilous accusation that there was something irregular about the marriage. It hadn't been conducted quite lawfully for whatever reason. Perhaps he was accused of bigamy, or she was accused of bigamy, or whatever it might be. So there was a degree of if you like, we might say that tongues used to wag about the Helmers family. There was a degree of uncertainty about what his marital situation was. He wasn't regarded as somebody who was, if you like, entirely on the level. What exactly that reflects, we'll come to later, I think. Now, if we fast forward to 1603, an important date, because that was the date when James I arrived on the throne from Scotland, then the situation in Nottinghamshire in 1603 was still pretty much as I've described it. It was still a fairly tense and divided county. There was still an element of feuding and rivalry between the gentry and the aristocracy, particularly Talbot versus Hollis and Stanhope. Catholics versus Puritan, but with these Puritan enclaves. There were also two further factors that were important. Now remember earlier on I mentioned the Earls of Rutland. Now the Earls of Rutland, the Manners family, they had traditionally provided a kind of counterbalance to the Talbot interests. The Talbot interests were more towards the north and the west of the county. The Manners interests were more towards the east and the south. And the Manners family provided, as I say, a kind of counterbalance. They're like a check and balance against the Talbots going too powerful. But the problem with the Manners family, the Earls of Rutland, was that they had suffered a fairly typical demographic blow. What had happened was that two of the Earls of Rutland had died in close succession to each other. Now that was a very unfortunate thing indeed to happen, because it meant that the next heir to the title, the next Earl of Rutland, was still a minor. He was only a child. I think he was about 11 or 12 years old when he inherited the title in the 1590s. And that effectively meant that for a period of 10 or 15 years or so, the Earls of Rutland were rendered impotent. They were unable to take any significant role in the life of the county. Not only that, but because there were two earls who had died, there were two dowager countesses of Rutland who engaged in something of a feud about what would happen to the family estate. So the Earls of Rutland, if you like, were rendered impotent. They were shunted off the stage. They were unable to perform their traditional role of being counterbalances to the Earls of Shrewsbury, the Talbots. So the Talbots were set for a period of dominance in the affairs of the county of a kind that hadn't been seen in Nottinghamshire for some considerable length of time, if ever. And there was one other situation which needs to be referred to, and that is this, that this was a period of severe economic hardship all across the Midlands of England, all across this region. The 1590s in particular had been a miserable and wretched time for the labouring poor in England. It was a time when prices of food and price of land, rents of land, were still rising sharply. There was a period of severe dearth amounting to famine in some parts of the country in the latter part of the 1590s during a series of failed harvests. There was also quite a heavy tax burden because Queen Elizabeth I was fighting her expensive war to subdue the rebels in Ireland. And in addition to that, there were epidemics of plague, severe epidemics of plague throughout the 1590s. It was a pretty wretched and miserable period. And it is the period that we see referred to obliquely in some of the work of Shakespeare. Shakespeare refers obliquely at various stages to the incidents, the kind of issues to which I've referred. Now, what this led to at the end of the 1590s was a very important development in English history, which was the new Elizabethan Poor Law. Because of the extent of hardship across the country as a whole, and because of the fear of social unrest and disorder, the Crown instituted the new Elizabethan Poor Laws, which placed a duty on the local parish to provide for the poor, to provide relief for the destitute. This is the first time in English history this has occurred, and it was a very decisive and important development, because what it also led to was, generally speaking, a tighter form of government at the parish level. Now, as we shall see, the government simultaneously was trying to impose a tighter form of government in religious matters too, but in general around this period, the parish was also being tightened up and becoming a rather more authoritarian structure, partly in response to the severe social and economic dislocations of the 1590s. Now, we're now going into the final part of the story, which is the events which actually led directly to Thomas Helwys's decision to separate from the Church of England, in conjunction with John Smythe, and then to lead a mass emigration of exiles across the North Sea to Amsterdam in 1608. And we just need to have a quick look at the geography again just to see exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a pretty small area here. This area is about 15 miles across. Down here you'll see Worksop, which is where the Earls of Shrewsbury lived, Worksop, at the top end of Sherwood Forest. Down here is Houghton Lound, where the Helwys family had traditionally been based, but they also have some sizable properties up here, around a place called Saundby, and further down the Trent Valley here. Over here is Scrooby in Austerfield, which was the home of William Bradford and William Brewster, the men who later became leaders of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. And you'll also notice something else, which is that this area here is an area of boggy swampland and marsh. Now, that is not bad news, it's actually good news, because this land was actually very rich grazing land for cattle. And it meant that this area here was quite a prosperous area full of lots of prosperous yeoman farmers. And a lot of the yeoman farmers of this area, the relatively prosperous yeoman farmers round in this kind of an arc of grazing land, were some of the backbone of the supporters of Thomas Helwys, John Robinson, John Smythe. This is where the real backbone of the separatist movement came from, this kind of area here. So this is the area we're talking about. As I say, not a large area. You could easily walk from here to here in half of a long day, and that's what people used to do, of course. Thomas Helwys lived off the map near Nottingham at Broxtowe, about 20 odd miles away, but that isn't too far away either. He could easily make it from Broxtowe to Gainsborough here in a long day on the back of a horse. Easily could be done, and often was done by people at the time. Right, the key decisive event that leads to a sea change in the affairs of the county is the arrival of James I in 1603. And he arrives down this road. Right up the middle of the map you'll see the Great North Road, which links Scotland to England via York. And it runs straight through the middle of the area we're talking about. James I came down the Great North Road. He came as far as Scrooby, and then he turned off to go to Worksop Manor. And he was entertained at Worksop Manor by the Earls of Shrewsbury in April of 1603 as he headed southwards. Now that was an important development, because what it signalled was the fact that the Talbot family were about to become very much the dominant leaders of Nottinghamshire. Because of Queen Elizabeth I's suspicions about the Talbots and their oddly close relationship to Mary Queen of Scots, they had been slightly eclipsed during the 1590s. They'd been sort of shunted to one side. This all changed. And it changed, and this man, Gilbert Talbot, the 7th Earl of Shrewsbury, became increasingly powerful. He was the stepson of Bess of Hardwicke. He was son of the 6th Earl. He had been eclipsed under Elizabeth, rehabilitated under James. And we know a great deal about him because he left behind a substantial body of papers which are now at the library of the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth Palace in London, where they provide an enormously important source of information about the affairs of this period, including some material about Thomas Helwys. The trouble was that he also had Catholic connections. Not just Catholic connections, he may actually have been a Roman Catholic. His wife was almost certainly Roman Catholic, and there is material in their papers that suggests they were Catholic, at least sympathizers. There is a giveaway, which is there's a document that survives in their papers, which consists of an order for a crucifix to be imported from Europe. Now, that's a bit of a giveaway, really, in Elizabethan England. You didn't actually have a crucifix in your house unless you were a Roman Catholic, and ordering one to be sent to you from the convent was rather a giveaway. So he was almost certainly at least had Puritan leanings and may actually have been a Catholic. Now, the secret of this was this. Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, increasingly emerged as James I's principal lieutenant in the region. He was given various honours, he was awarded status, he became a frequent attender at court, and he became increasingly influential. Now, in 1603 to 1605, famously, a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard Bancroft, whom I talked about last night, reporting directly to the King, to James I, embarked upon a purge of nonconformists from the Church of England. He also embarked upon a purge of Roman Catholics too, and his activities against Roman Catholics were always far more extensive, but he embarked upon a purge of Protestant nonconformists from the Anglican Church. And this reached a peak in the spring of 1605, spring and summer of 1605, when he disposed of about 70 or 80 Puritan ministers from the Church of England. When I say disposed of, they weren't executed or anything like that, they weren't even sent to prison. They simply had their livelihoods away. They were deprived of their parish ministries around the country. That was terribly important. Effectively, at a stroke, Bancroft was able to decapitate the Puritan movement in England. And that included the decapitation, I say metaphorical decapitation, not the literal decapitation, of a number of Puritan ministers in Nottinghamshire. And a particularly important place was a place called Babworth, which is somewhere up here, can't quite find it, there it is. Babworth was the parish of a man called Richard Clifton, who achieved an enormous amount of distinction at the time as one of the principal mentors of the men who later became the Mayflower Pilgrims. He was one of the ministers who was deprived of his parish in 1605. And from that moment forth, anyone who was a Puritan in the region knew that he was in danger in one way or another. Not in danger of execution, not in danger of anything quite as dramatic as that, but in danger simply of being prevented from pursuing the kind of religious observance that they would have regarded as being not only right and proper, but their duty in the eye of God. So James I has arrived, Gilbert Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, is becoming increasingly important, and a number of other things are happening too. Last night I referred to the Bancroft Canons. These were the new rules and regulations imposed by Archbishop Bancroft, 141 in all, intended to provide a kind of armour-plated form of government for the local parish, to ensure that everybody toed the line, that everybody obeyed all the rules and regulations that he wanted to impose, governing forms of worship, governing the maintenance of the church, governing the conduct of the preacher, governing just about everything. The Bancroft Canons had come into force in the south of England in 1604, but in the north of England, which includes Nottinghamshire, they did not come into force until 1606, to the middle of 1606. And in practice, they didn't actually come into force until 1607 because the Archbishop of York had died in January 1606. And there was a period of vacancy while a new Archbishop was appointed and that new Archbishop arrived. The new Archbishop was a man called Toby Matthew, but he was busy doing other things. So he didn't actually arrive in York to take up his post until the spring of 1607. And it was only at that point that the new regulations, the Bancroft Canons, actually in practice came into force in the Nottinghamshire area. At this point, three men converged: Helwys, Smythe and Robinson. Thomas Helwys, who we already discussed this evening, John Smythe, who I discussed last night, and John Robinson, who was the spiritual mentor of the Mayflower Pilgrims. He had been a Cambridge academic, a fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. He had also been a preacher in the town of Norwich, where he had fallen foul of the authorities during the purge of 1605. He's not inclined exactly what he did, but he fell foul of the authorities, lost his post there. And so he had no means of livelihood. Highly educated man, Puritan disposition, no means of livelihood. John Smythe, similarly, highly educated man, Puritan disposition, no means of livelihood. no prospect of advancing to the Church of England, ordained minister but no prospect of actually obtaining a lucrative career. Thomas Helwys, as we've seen, a man from an aspirational, ambitious Nottinghamshire family with a father who was a fierce Calvinist, and a man who stood on the Protestant side of the sectarian divide in Nottinghamshire, on the other side of the factional divide also from the Talbots. So I think you can see that we have quite a potent little mixture of ingredients here that might lead to a crisis. And it came in due course with the arrival of Toby Matthew, the new Archbishop of York. Now this was an immensely important event. This was really the critical event that would lead to the emigration of the separatists. Archbishop Matthew arrived in the spring-summer of 1607, and he immediately embarked upon a diligent campaign to stamp his mark upon the archdiocese, primarily by a vigorous campaign to stamp out what remained of Roman Catholicism. He travelled incessantly. He gave an enormous number of sermons. Archbishop Matthew was a very, very diligent, hard-working individual. Although he was often very ill, he was a very diligent preacher, an indefatigable preacher, would preach in all weathers. And he travelled endlessly around the archdiocese when weather permitted. The weather was often appalling, of course. He travelled around the archdiocese, stamping out Catholics wherever he could find them, and locking them up in the castle at York if he had to. And the records of Archbishop Matthew's persecution of the Catholics survive today. They are in the archives at York, and they run on for pages and pages and pages with long lists of the names of Roman Catholics in Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire who were arrested, taken to York assizes often, and in some cases, of course, were subject to the death penalty. That usually only applied in fairly extreme cases to actual Catholic priests rather than lay people. So Archbishop Matthew arrived in the spring and summer of 1607 and began this process. Now, the Protestant nonconformists of the area, the Puritans, people associated with the ministers who had lost their posts, people associated with Helwys, Smythe, Robinson, were not, as I say, his initial concern. They were not the key focus of attention, but in due course they could expect him to turn his attention to them as well. And this gradually happened. Now, even now, it was not inevitable that they would be subject immediately to the full rigour of the law, because England at the time had a very complicated legal system whereby, although the church courts, the church authorities could summon people before them in cases where they were alleged to be breaking the rules of the church, the punishments that the church courts could hand out were pretty mild. They could hand out small fines, they could excommunicate people from the church, they could do that kind of thing, but they couldn't actually send you to prison. If they were going to send you to prison, they had to invoke the secular authorities, that is to say the justices of the peace in the area, at the Court of Sessions. That was what they had to do. And in this particular area of Nottinghamshire, the justices of the peace were in some cases actually quite sympathetic towards the Puritans of the area. Helwys himself was a justice of the peace Gervase Helwys over in Lincolnshire, but there were some other members of the local bench of the justice of the peace who clearly were pretty reluctant to engage in a wholesale purge of Puritans, many of whom, of course, were their friends and neighbours, and many of whom they also saw as allies against the great threat of Roman Catholicism. So they were unwilling to launch this kind of great purge. But in due course they had to. As Toby Matthew stepped up his activities in the summer and autumn of 1607, he placed the local magistrates, or at least this appears to be what happened, he placed the local magistrates under pressure to act. And so in the autumn of 1607, we begin to see for the first time, October 1607 roughly, we begin to see references in the Court of Sessions records of Nottinghamshire to Protestant separatists, Protestant nonconformists, friends of Thomas Helwys, being brought up before the courts and threatened with prosecution, and threatened in some cases with being sent to the assizes, which was the assize courts were the places where you could, in theory, receive a substantial prison sentence. This starts in the October of 1607 when we start to see records and notices in the Court of Sessions minutes, the minutes of the Court of Sessions by the Justices of the Peace, showing Protestant nonconformists being prosecuted. That's October 1607. Also in the autumn of 1607, Toby Matthew's officials arrived to arrest William Brewster at Scrooby. William Brewster, the later a Mayflower Brook, they arrived to arrest him. They arrested Thomas Helwys' wife, Joan. She was arrested. She was carted off to York to appear before the Ecclesiastical Court of High Commission, which was the name given to the most important church court in the Archdiocese of York. So in the autumn of 1607, we see the beginnings of a great purge of the laity. In 1605, they're taking care of Puritan clergymen. In the autumn of 1607, Toby Matthews started to take care of the laity as well. And it was this point that plans began to be laid to emigrate to the safety of the Dutch Republic. In the autumn of 1607, the leading separatists of the area, the leading Puritans of the area rather, Thomas Helwys, Robinson, Clifton and so on, made their first attempt to organise a flight to Holland. They travelled to the port city of Boston in Lincolnshire, which of course later gave its name to Boston, Massachusetts, and there they laid their first plans to hire a ship to sail across the North Sea to Amsterdam. They were betrayed, the ship was seized and arrested by the magistrates in the town. Some of them were apparently imprisoned in the Guildhall at Nottingham, and various documents survive. One particular document which appears to be a writ or a writ for indictment of these characters, which indicates that about 12 of them, led by Helwys, probably also with Brewster involved too, and certainly Richard Clifton, were arrested, detained, subsequently released. For whatever reason, it's not entirely clear. But that was the end of this debacle of Boston was the end of their first attempt to leave the country. The second attempt was far more successful, and this led to the events at Stallingborough Haven in the spring of 1608, with Thomas Helwys in the lead. And in my book, Making Haste to Babylon, you will find this described in some detail. It happened here. This is the location from which Thomas Helwys and his colleagues attempted to leave the country, and most of them successfully did so. In 1608. This is the exact location. It's at a place called Stallingborough Haven, near the port of Immingham on the coast of Lincolnshire, from which it's about 200 miles across the North Sea to Amsterdam. You will notice several things about it. You'll notice, for example, these great big wharves and jetties and so forth. Hang on. These wharves and jetties with oil tankers. Well, the reason the oils and jetties are there because this is the port of Immingham, which is the largest portway. It's the largest or the second largest seaport by tonnage in the United Kingdom. It's a huge oil port. These are oil tankers which are tying up at these jetties in order to take away large quantities of crude oil which have been refined and which are on the way to Rotterdam or wherever. It's a very important, today it's an extremely important seaport. In the time of the Pilgrims, 1608, it wasn't. In the time of the Pilgrims, it was a very remote spot indeed. And it was also in those days, as it is now, extremely muddy. What you will notice is this is a very muddy beach indeed, very muddy. The water is very dirty, that's because the water is silt. And you'll also see that it's foggy. And indeed, much of the time, this particular spot is very foggy. I took this picture in May of 2008, more or less on the 400th anniversary of the date of the departure of the separatists from Stallingborough in 1608, and I suspect the conditions were more or less the same. You'll also notice this thing here. This looks like a rather dirty, muddy ditch, and that's exactly what it is. It is a rather dirty, muddy ditch. It's a sewer. It opens out into the sea, and it's full of rather nasty-smelling effluent. But it hasn't always been a sewer. It was also a stream. It's effectively the path of an ancient stream which flows out into the sea. And this, as I say, at the time was a remote haven that was occasionally used by fishing vessels. It was very remote indeed. An ideal location, in other words, in which to flee by sea to Amsterdam without the authorities capturing you. And what happened was this. Thomas Helwys, the reason we can be categorical about what occurred on this occasion was that a series of documents survive in the National Archives in London, which are depositions which were taken from Thomas Helwys and one of his manservants, and from various other individuals involved, in May of 1608, after they were arrested by the authorities as they tried to make their escape. These are this is the record, the official record made of testimony that they gave under prosecution, under interrogation rather. Now, in fact, Thomas Helwys actually said nothing at all. He refused to give any testimony. He didn't quite take the Fifth Amendment because he didn't have the Fifth Amendment. He simply refused to say anything on the grounds that he might incriminate himself. You'll notice this document have an official stamp on them. That is an official stamp dating from the reign of Queen Victoria when the documents were first catalogued on Her Majesty's service. It also has various numbers. These were written on there by various custodians of the archives in London who were trying to come up with different systems for numbering the papers. I'm not sure exactly why they had to have so many numbers, why they had to keep crossing them out, but anyway, that's the way it is. This document is actually in extremely good condition. These documents, as I say, are available at the National Archives at Kew. They've actually now been digitised because the state papers of this period, of which this forms part of, have now been digitised in their entirety by a company called Gale Group, and they're now actually available at fairly exorbitant expense, I must say, on the internet. But these are very important documents indeed, because these tell us exactly what happened in May 1608 with the flight from Stanningborough Haven. What happened was this. Thomas Helwys and his colleagues had, by the autumn of 1607, already clearly decided that they needed to escape, leave the country, and head to the Netherlands. The reason was really very simply this. It was because once the Bancroft canons were fully in force, and once the local justices of the peace in Nottinghamshire had begun to assist the Archbishop of York in his persecution of the Puritans, then they really had nowhere else to go. They were in a situation where it was quite likely within a matter of months they would be subject to, at the very best, severe fines, at the very worst, long periods of imprisonment. It was most unlikely they could actually be subject to the death penalty, because that was an entirely different matter. Only if they had been found guilty of treason or sedition could they have been subject to the death penalty. It wasn't impossible, it was extremely unlikely. But nevertheless, they were in a situation they really had no option but to flee the country. And it was Thomas Helwys who led the attempt to do so. And what Thomas Helwys did was, he did what any sensible person would do. He used the River Trent. Most of his supporters were based around the town of Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. But Gainsborough is on the River Trent. It's actually a seaport even now. It's possible for seagoing ships to get up as far as Gainsborough. And in those days, it was actually even more important as a seaport. It was in Lincolnshire, but only just across the river from Nottinghamshire. Most of his supporters were in that area. And so what Thomas Helwys did was that he hired a coal barge called the Francis, whose normal occupation was to sail back and forth up and down the Trent, carrying coal from the Nottinghamshire coalfields out and then down the North Sea to London, where it was used as house coal. So he hired the Francis, the coal barge. He did so, strange enough, in the name of his cousin, Sir Gervase Helwys, who was Sheriff of Lincolnshire at the time. Now, it's not quite clear whether Sir Gervase Helwys knew that his name was taken in vain in this way. Sir Gervase Helwys does not appear to have been the brightest man in the world, and after someone might like to ask me about the fate of Sir Gervase Helwys, which was a rather unfortunate one, a rather sad one. But Thomas Helwys hired the barge in the name of his cousin Gervase Helwys, and the barge at Gainsborough picked up about 50 or 60 men, women and children with the intention of taking them down to Stanningborough Haven and then shipping them off on a Dutch ship which was going to meet them there to Amsterdam. And of course, all went horribly wrong. The reason it went horribly wrong was because of something you will remember from the photograph, which is this. The photograph. Now, what you'll notice, I say, is the water is extremely mucky, it's very dirty, the beach is very muddy, the Humber is full of sandbanks and shifting shoals. It's an extremely treacherous river, the Humber, which is why you will very rarely see a yachtsman or a pleasure craft venturing onto it. It is a very important river. It is a main artery of communication. As I said, there's this great seaport in Immingham, but it's very treacherous indeed. And without a pilot, it is very likely that any vessel coming down this river will get stuck on the mud at some stage. It also has quite vicious winds and tides. And that's, of course, is what happened. The Francis got stuck on the mud out in the estuary. Meanwhile, another group of separatists had trekked overland from another part of Nottinghamshire. They'd trekked overland to rendezvous with the barge on the shore so they could all head off to Amsterdam. The men on land, aiming to rendezvous with the barge, including Thomas Helwys, were able to escape because the Dutch ship arrived with the tide. They were able to row out to it, but the barge containing the men, women, and children was stuck fast. Even then, it might have been possible to escape, but somehow or other, the authorities in Grimsby, the town of Grimsby, a few miles away, had heard about what was going on, and suddenly they arrived on the scene. All of this incident was described in some detail and quite graphically by William Bradford, the Mayflower Pilgrim, in his great history of the Plymouth colony, but without giving details of location, without giving legal date. And these documents actually enable us to fill in the picture. What occurred at Stanningborough Haven was that the authorities arrived from Grimsby. They arrived with a band of armed men, probably the local militia, whose job usually was to hunt down Roman Catholic recusants. But they arrived in this case, they arrested everyone they could find. Some of the men who had arrived overland had been able to make their escape by boat to the Dutch ship, which then sailed off to Amsterdam. But the men, the women, the children, Thomas Helwys, Joan Helwys, and some of his key supporters were held and detained on the shore by the magistrates. The magistrates then took them down the road to Grimsby, where they interrogated them and these depositions were the result. As I said, Thomas Helwys himself kept stum. He hardly said a word, didn't say anything. He was clearly a man who was capable of keeping cool under pressure, but the crew of the vessel, the crew of the coal barge, and various other people who were around at the time gave pretty much the full picture. And so that was how the flight came partially to grief. As I say, probably about 20 men had managed to get across the sea to Amsterdam, but the women and children, Helwys himself, were stuck fast and arrested. However, the reality was that the authorities found this something of an embarrassment. They had managed to arrest a large contingent, effectively, of women and children. Women and children who then had to be looked after, women and children who then had to return to their homes, women and children who couldn't really be accused of any significant offence, because women and children at the time were not regarded as people who were capable of being prosecuted for an offence of religious nonconformity. So they effectively had to be released. Thomas Helwys was released for some strange reason too, not entirely clearly why, we don't know. There are lots and lots of questions and puzzles about all this episode, all this period of history, to which we will never really know the answer, but he was released too. Joan Helwys, his wife, was a slightly different matter. Now the problem with her was that she'd been imprisoned in York the previous autumn, and then she'd been released on bail. But she jumped her bail to try and cross the North Sea with Thomas Helwys, so she was in more trouble than he was. So she was taken off to York and locked up. But in due course they released her too. Again, it's not entirely clear why, but they decided to release them. And so, although they'd lost a round here, they'd lost round one in attempting to flee from Boston, they'd sort of lost round two in that the flight from Immingham had only been a partial success. But nevertheless, gradually during the course of that year, Helwys too was able to slip away across the North Sea to Amsterdam. So did John Robinson, so did John Smythe. We don't know exactly how and when John Robinson and John Smythe slipped away across the North Sea, but gradually they all did. So did William Brewster, so did William Bradford. Probably they did so via London. That was always the easiest way to get to the Netherlands, to go via London, where there was safety in numbers, where you could merge into the crowd. That's probably how they did it. We really don't know. But what we do know is this, that by 1608, the great movement had begun across the North Sea, which in due course, and after a lot of adventures, had actually become a movement across the Atlantic as well, to foundation of the Plymouth colony. And Thomas Helwys had been at the centre of it. And just by way of conclusion, let's sum up where we are. Basically, Thomas Helwys was a man who came from a family in Nottinghamshire who had risen meteorically, the Helwys family. They had come from really nowhere in the 1500s, 1520s. By virtue of their alliance with the Hollis family, they had emerged as significant local landowners. They had achieved high office in London and in Lincolnshire, in the local area. They had also become fervent Calvinists. But they had fallen foul of their, certainly in Thomas Helwys' case, they had fallen foul of the Earl of Shrewsbury. They had fallen foul of the Archbishop of York. They had become men left with no option at all, in the case of Thomas Helwys, but to take refuge in a foreign land. What had happened was very much a local crisis, if you like. It had been conditioned by all the circumstances I talked about. The fact that this was quite a turbulent county, that it was a county with a very deep religious sectarian divide, that it was a county with some very strong personalities involved, such as the Earl of Shrewsbury, that it was a county which had undergone a series of quite a rapid transformation in a fairly short order of time. It was conditioned, if you like, by all of these local events in Nottinghamshire. But it was also a symptom of a kind of a national malaise or a national predicament, which was this, is that at this period, men and women who regard themselves as Puritans, men and women who were nonconformists, men and women who felt excluded, so to speak, by the new authoritarianism of James I's regime, were really left with no alternative but to flee. So that was a fundamental problem. Now, for the time being, of course, having fled, they took themselves off the chessboard, as it were. They took themselves out of the theatre of English politics. And for a while, for a period of 20-odd years or so, separatism became, if you like, a dormant force in England. It really had little relevance to politics. It was sort of forgotten about. But of course, what was happening here, what the Crown had done, what Bancroft had done, what the authorities had done, by behaving in the way they had in places such as Nottinghamshire, was that they had created, in effect, a series of dormant tensions which were eventually going to give rise to the great conflicts of the 1640s and the English Civil War. And that is where I will leave you, just with just one parting thought, which is this. We don't know what happened to separatism in the Nottinghamshire area after the departure of Thomas Helwys. It may be that it simply vanished. It may be it simply ceased altogether. There are occasional little cases referred to in the archives of someone being accused of being a separatist about 1620, 1625, but not very much. We don't really know what happened to it. But what we do know was that in 1642, when the English Civil War began, and in 1645, 1646, when Oliver Cromwell formed the New Model Army as the stormtroopers, so to speak, of the parliamentary cause, we do know that then suddenly separatists reappeared in Nottinghamshire. There are important records, there are important accounts, interesting, significant accounts of the English Civil War as it developed in Nottinghamshire, in which it is clearly referred to that the artillerymen, the men who fired the guns in the parliamentary army in Nottinghamshire, were separatists. And it is some of those men appear to have come from families who had been involved in the separatist events of the early 1600s. So effectively what the authorities had done in throwing out Thomas Helwig, well, they really hadn't solved anything at all. And in due course, the separatists would come storming back. And of course, for a while, they would actually take control of England as a whole, because Oliver Cromwell himself was a separatist. He was himself effectively a Brownist. And from this low point, which we've been discussing here, they would come back and they would become, in effect, the government for a brief period of 10 years or so, from the latter 1640s till the restoration of King Charles II. And with that, I shall draw to a close, and